Hello students, today we're going to look at section 9.4, which is called completing the square, or actually solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So let's see what the hell that means. So if I have something like x squared plus bx, and I wanted to complete the square, if you'll remember back several weeks ago, we completed to complete the square, or when you have a perfect square trinomial, then you can factor it pretty simply. So in order to complete the square, what I have to do if I have x squared plus bx, there's no c here, so I've got to figure out what is c going to be in order to complete the square. So the way I do that is I take half of b, which would be b over 2, and then I simply square that. And so whatever b is, let's say b is 4. If I take 4 and then take half of 4, which is 2, and square it as 4, then 4 would be a completing of the square. We need a complete square in order to factor easily so that we can find the solutions to our quadratic equations, instead of perhaps having to graph them or plug it into the calculator to find out the table of values and all. This is just another way we can solve quadratic equations, again, completing the square. So let's look at an example. Let's say I have x squared plus 10x. And I need to know what goes here in the c position in order to make a perfect square trinomial. So if I have x squared plus 10x, and then so I take b, and b is 10, and I take half of 10. Half of 10 is 5, and then I square that and I get 25, so 25 is c. Again, I took half of 10, which is 5, and squared it, and I got 25. Now to factor x squared plus 10x plus 25, we'll go back a couple of weeks. This would just be the square root of x squared plus the square root of 25. Whoops, that's supposed to be a 5. Squared. So the two binomial factors of x squared plus 10x plus 25 are x plus 5 and x plus 5, and the way we write that is x plus 5 squared. Just to recap, if I take the square root of 25 and double it, then I should come up with b to get a perfect square trinomial, which is exactly what I did. So let's look at a couple more just to find out what c equals in order to make a perfect square trinomial. So I've got x squared minus 8x. So I take half of negative 8, which is negative 4, and I square that, and I get 16. So it's positive 16. X squared minus 8x plus 16 is now my perfect square trinomial, and I can factor it by x minus 4 squared. Because remember, if that's negative, then it's negative here. So let's look at the second one, x squared minus 20x. Well, I've got to figure out what c is. So I take half of negative 20, and that's negative 10, and I square that, and I get positive 100. So x squared minus 20x plus 100 is my perfect square, and then I factor that by finding the square root of x squared, which is x, minus, because that's a negative, and then the square root of 100, which is 10, and then I square that, and I have the factors of perfect square trinomials. Now we're going to use those in equations and figure out how to solve the equations that way. So we have this equation, x squared minus 6x equals 7. And what I need to do is be able to solve this. And you know what we used to do is we used to bring 7 to the other side and then factor it out and do that. Well, that's really a difficult process because 7's not a perfect square and stuff. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to complete this square. So I've got x squared minus 6x. What can I add to this x squared minus 6x to make it a perfect square trinomial? And then I'm going to add that to both sides. So I'm going to take half of negative 6, which is negative 3, and then I square negative 3, and I get positive 9. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. And I write that x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals 7 plus 9. Again, I have to add the 9 to both sides in order for me to do the proper rules of solving equations. I can add something to both sides and it'd still be okay. So x squared minus 6x plus 9 is now a perfect square trinomial, and I factor it. And I factor it to x minus 3 squared equals 7 plus 9 is 16. Now here's where we're going to learn something new. I've got to find out what x equals, not what x minus 3 squared equals. So in order to do that, because I've got to do the square root, the opposite, excuse me, because I've got the squared, the opposite of squared is the square root. So I've got to find the square root of both sides. So I'm going to do the square root of x minus 3 squared equals the square root of 16. Again, what I do to one side, I have to do to the other, so I'm finding the square root of both sides. Now the square root of x minus 3 squared, as you think in your head, what times itself equals x minus 3 squared? Well, that would be x minus 3. So the square root of x minus 3 squared is simply x minus 3. And we know that equals the square root of 16. But remember from long, long ago in a land far, far away, we remembered that the square root of a number always has two answers, a positive and a negative. So I need to write down that the square root of 16 is plus or minus 4. That's a key step. The square root of 16 is plus or minus 4, not just 4. So now I'm going to add 3 to both sides. But here's where it gets tricky. Typically when we add 3 to both sides, we put it on the end, but not now. When I have a plus or minus, the 3 has to come first. So when I add 3 to both sides, or I just move the 3 to the other side, I get x equals 3 plus or minus 4. When I brought the 3 to the other side, it comes in front of or before the plus or minus. So now I have x equals 3 plus or minus 4. And in this case, I've got to see what is 3 plus 4 and what is 3 minus 4 to figure out what my two solutions are. So I would do x equals 3 plus 4 or x equals 3 minus 4. Let me adjust the camera a tad. And so x equals 7 or negative 1. So those are the two solutions to my equation. 7 or negative 1. So I could plug in 7 or negative 1 and I would get this answer. Let's recap just a tad. First, I complete the square. That means I need a perfect square trinomial by taking half of b and squaring it, so then I added 9 to both sides. Then I factored my perfect square and factored, and then I found the square root of both sides, and then came up with two equations to get two answers. In our next example, we have the equation negative 2x squared plus 8x minus 18 equals 0. And just like we always do, we look to see if we have a greatest common factor, and we do. So we're going to divide everything by negative 2. So let's get everything divided by negative 2. Negative 2x squared divided by negative 2 is just x squared. 8x divided by negative 2 is minus 4x. And negative 18 divided by negative 2 is plus 9 equals 0. Now, is this a perfect square trinomial? No. The square root of 9 is 3. So when I take 3 and add and double it, I don't get negative 6, so it's not a perfect square trinomial. So in this case, what I have to do is get rid of this 9 and move it to the other side so I can create a perfect square. So I'm going to do x squared minus 4x equals negative 9. I need to get the 9 away, so I have x squared minus 4x, and now I can complete that square. So I take half of b, and I get negative 2, and I square that, and I get positive 4. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides. You with me? So now I have x squared minus 4x plus 4, which is a perfect square trinomial. So my factors are x minus 2 squared equals negative 5. Okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the square root of both sides. So x minus 2 squared, and we find the square root of that, equals the square root of negative 5. But we've learned this in the past before. I can't find the square root of a negative number this year. That's not possible. So when I have to find the square root of a negative number, that means there are no solutions. Because once again, it's impossible to find the square root of a negative number because nothing times itself equals a negative. A negative times a negative is positive, and a positive times positive, positive. So I cannot find the factors of a square root of a negative number. That means there's no solution. So here's another example we're going to look at. 3x squared minus 9x minus 3 equals 21. And you can tell already that there's a greatest common factor that we've got to get rid of. Excuse me. So we're going to factor out the 3. We're going to divide everything by 3 and see what we come up with. So I've got x squared minus 3x minus 1 equals 7. Now, is that a perfect square trinomial? Can I take the square root of 1 and add it or double it and get negative 3? No, I can't. So it's not a perfect square trinomial. So I need to move the 1 to the other side so I can create a perfect square trinomial. So we have x squared minus 3x equals 8, because when I bring the negative 1 over here, it becomes positive. What's half of 3? Yes, it's negative 1.5. Oh, decimals. Then I take negative 1.5 and I square it, and I get plus 2.25, because 1.5 times 1.5 is 2.25. So then I have to add it to both sides. So now I have x squared minus 3x plus 2.25 equals 8 plus 2.25. Is this a perfect square trinomial? Absolutely. The square root of 2.25 is negative 1.5, double it, and I get negative 3. So I'm going to write down my factors, which is x minus 1.5 squared. Have you noticed that this number is always half of b when we have a perfect square trinomial? Have you noticed that? I hope so. Equals 10.25. Okay? This is where we got to have a calculator handy. So now I'm going to find the square root of both sides. Square root of this side, square root of that side. No negatives over here, so we're safe. So the square root of x minus 1.5 squared is x minus 1.5. And since the square root of 10.25 is not an integer, I'm going to leave it exactly like that. Now, if that was 16 and I knew it was 4, then I'd keep going. But since it is not, I'm just going to leave it as the square root of 10.5. So I have the square root of 10.25. So now I've got to move the negative 1.5 to the other side. And that's where I get, let me adjust the camera a tad, x equals 1.5 plus or minus the square root of 10.25. And our calculator. What is 1.5 plus the square root of 10.25? I'm so glad you asked. When I round it, it is 4.7. The magic of the camera, I already figured it out. And then what is 1.5 minus the square root of 10.25? I'm glad you asked, because that's negative 1.7. So the two solutions, or the approximated solutions, to this quadratic equation are 4.7 and negative 1.7. Here are your two practice problems for this video. The first one is find c to complete the square. If I have x squared plus 16x, what is c to complete the square? And the second one is solve by completing the square. X squared minus 8x minus 1 equals 8. Do what you need to complete the square, to solve the equation. I'll give you a hint. These are going to be integers. Okay, no decimals involved at all. These will be integers. Okay, so take a picture of your practice problems and submit it using the turn-in button in Edmodo.